welcoming everyone to this seminar. It is indeed our great honor to host Professor Achille Mbembe in our seminar series this year, and this is the first one for 2023. And those who have been following the seminar in 2022, we also had Professor Achille Mbembe opening for the semester with the theme Africa in Theory. And this year, we also have him talking about his new book, The Earthly Community. And I don't want to waste people's time by over-introducing you, Prof, because you are well known. So I think we can begin, and we will give you, Prof, 60 minutes to deliver your presentation, and then Bongani will take over and chair the Q&A. Thank you so much, and you are all welcome, and they were excited, and they want to hear more about the earthly community.
Thank you so much, Sabelo, and Bongani, and the other colleagues who have.
Maybe, Prof, I forgot something,
yes,
which is very, very important.
Yes.
When we started, it was my chair in University of Bayreuth plus the Johannesburg Institute of Advanced Study.
Yes.
This year we are joined by Codesria also as a co-host, and that is very important for us.
No, definitely. In fact, I was going to mention all these institutions. Of course, the Sabelo's chair in Germany and the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study, which has become a key node in the new landscape of thought, at least in our continent, and of course Codesria. I worked for Codesria for some time, not too long ago. So I'm very happy to be back, Sabelo and Bongani. So tonight, I would like to offer a set of remarks on something I call the last utopia. The last utopia, of which I suggest the Earth with capital E, is, it seems to me, the ultimate manifestation. But as a starting point, I think I owe you some clarification. A clarification needs to be made between different terms or notions. Nowadays, we keep using almost interchangeably. For instance, when I say the Earth with capital E, I do not mean the world. I don't mean the globe, or even the planet. But nor do I mean the cosmos or the universe. By invoking the concept of the Earth with capital E, I am not making a commentary on humanity at the exclusion of the physical world, which a gesture classical humanism is known to perform almost at every turn in its attempt to place the human at the apex of, let's just call it the creation. I'm referring, of course, when I say the Earth with capital E, to the geological magma-filled rock we know of, but I also include in the concept of the earth, phenomena such as the plants, such as animals, such as minerals. In other words, I am trying to summon through the concept of the earth all life on that rock called the earth. Human life, as well as the life of the plants and others, as well as the life of the rock itself, as it is taught to us, let's say, for instance, by Earth system science, or by geomorphology, the discipline of geomorphology, or for that matter, of geology itself. So for me, but that's something we might want to debate during the conversation that will follow the presentation. For me, it goes without saying that the rock itself is part of a bigger entity, the universe. If by the universe we imply, of course, the physical planet of the physical planets themselves, atoms, as well as, I should add, the metaphysical and spiritual aspects contained therein. So this is what I mean when I invoke the concept of the earth. And in my mind, the earth as a category of thought, but also as the manifestation of the last utopia, is a bit more than just a planet. It is a bit more than the biophysical, organic, and mineral order without which it would not exist. It is a bit more than the global collective of the humanity which inhabits it. It is, if you want, the living world in its multiplicity, as this living world undergoes its endless process of transformation. A transformation which has no omega point. Nor is it, in fact, supposed to reach an apex or ultimately reach a moment of unification in any kind of figure, religious or otherwise. It includes all creation, the whole world, all the people of the world, the artificial creations or works of humanity, the mass of things humanity has invented, all mixed bodies, the whole physical universe, all reality, the spiritual and biological energies consistent with the definition of the living world. That is what I mean by the earth with capital E. The earth as a category of thought, and the earth as the manifestation of what I call the last utopia. So I owed you those clarifications so that we let's say, enter into this conversation with more or less the same understanding of the concepts, or if we do not agree, that we know what we don't agree about. So the question I deal with, particularly in the latest book, Sabelo has mentioned it. It's called The Earthly Community, just came out a month or so ago. The question I deal with in that book, and which I'm trying to introduce to our discussion tonight, this question is, to what extent can this living world, as I have just defined it, to what extent can it be the basis for a new idea, not of universalism or universality, as in the old narrative of human emancipation, but a new idea of community. Or if you want, a new idea of the in common, especially at a time when repairing and sharing this roof and shelter the earth as equitably as possible, at a time when this is the condition of sustainability of life on earth. That is the question I am exploring. In other words, can the earth, thus described, be considered as a community? If so, what kind of community? And does it actually form one? So those are the questions I am interested in exploring. Now, to define the earth in this manner, that is, in terms of the living world in its entirety and its immense, innumerable manifestations, including technological devices and other artificial and externalized apparatuses, to define the earth in this manner, in its myriad richness, I had to heavily draw on old African concepts of general ecology. So the second key node for our conversation I would like to highlight has to do then with this notion of general ecology, which once again I draw fundamentally from old African cosmologies. Now, as we all know, not so long ago, these old African concepts, these African systems of thought, as well as the set of knowledges and practices they paved the way for, all of this was derogatorily called animism. Animism meaning a way of thinking and a way of acting, a way of thinking other things, of thinking differently to the ways that we have wrongly deemed assignable to inferior societies. Animism was the name we gave to modes of thinking and acting, presumably originating from inferior or primitive societies. So what I'm suggesting is that what was derogatorily called animism is in fact a theory of general ecology. A theory of general ecology at the heart of which, at the core of which, is the deep belief that the earth is, in fact, first and foremost, a community. What kind of community a community of the living in its myriad richness. And when I say the living, is not in opposition to the dead, because in fact, in this concept of community, the dead, the unborn, the still to be born, are all part of a continuum. And when I say the living in its myriad richness, I have in mind all kinds of things, of course, all the invisible and obscure forces, the ancestors, their substitutes, together with the spirits and masks and dances and rituals and ceremonies, funerals, festivals. And yet, not all these things are of the same kind. And they are, strictly speaking, different forces and entities. But each in its own way is a sketch of the living. So that's the first important, say, aspect of what I call general ecology. Now, to ground all of this somewhat, let me signal a work I love going back to, among many others, when I really want to decenter myself or my own way of thinking. It's a novel which was published in 1952 by Amos Tutuola. The title of the novel is The Palm Wine Drinkard. The argument I'm trying to make is that, in fact, the palm wine drinkard paints a striking picture of this general ecology. Of course, we have many other pictures painted by historians, especially environmental historians, anthropologists, a number of people working in the field of biodiversity. But I'm very fond of this novel because it provides us with a vivid description of this general ecology. And here, a few pointers will suffice to give you a sense of its vitality and its complexity. So first of all, significant within this general ecology, as described by and imagined by Amos Tutuola, is how within, of course, these parameters, nothing formally prohibits anything at all from happening. There's a concept of history which is widely open-ended. Widely open-ended in the sense that here, the thesis basically is that there is no absolute impossibility. In other words, time and history are fundamentally open-ended. And this is very different from the kind of reading we have had. I don't know whether it's still valid, but not so long ago, the idea was that in Africa, we somewhat subscribed to a theory of time as cyclical. What I'm saying is that when we take seriously the palm wine drinkard as a treatise on general ecology, nothing would be far from from that idea that somewhat history is cyclical. No. The theory of history, which Tutuola shares with us, is one in which history is fundamentally open-ended. And nothing is mere continuous repetition of the same. So that's the first key pointer in terms of what mean by general ecology. Second, there is nothing passive or inert. And when I say this like this, in fact, what I'm suggesting, what Tutuola is suggesting, is at the total opposite of certain traditions of Western metaphysics, which believe that the real or reality is divided between that which is active and that which is inert. The subject who acts, the object who is shaped, formed, and acted upon. What Tutuola suggests is an entirely different paradigm, one, I would say, of redistributive agency. That agency is widely redistributed. It is widely shared. And no force, no entity monopolizes in and of itself the totality of what it means to be an actant or an agent. It is fundamentally redistributed. Now, of course, taken in isolation, as I just said, no subject, no force has full control over its freedom or destiny. And in that sense, and this is the third pointer, life as such has an arborescent quality, and thus contains a multitude of possible futures. It's not just one future. I mean, there's not one kind of universal future. There are always, I mean, life contains a multitude of possible futures, and life is not only woven of uncertainties, but randomness is part of its structure. And more fundamentally, life is always exposed to disintegration. And in fact, the whole novel is about this story of life having to undergo multiple metamorphoses, changing constantly, taking different shapes, being exposed to a multiplicity of risks, and therefore requiring constantly one form or another of consolidation or of supplementation, if such a term exists in English. And as every risk threatens to turn into an existential risk, the living subject is one that is prepared for incessant mutations and is able to change its state. And in order precisely to change constantly, to, let's say, develop that capacity to transform constantly, relation is fundamental. If you want me to put it differently, relationality takes precedence over ontology. But the question of being only has a meaning in relation to the question of relationality. And when I say the question of being, when I invoke ontological images, what Tutuola suggests is that identity, or what we nowadays call identity, is really about that capacity constantly to relate and to transform various sketches of life into dynamic assemblages. So it's a concept of identity, which is pretty much at the opposite of, let's say, dominant narratives of identity today. So in that sense, Tutuola is extremely interesting for, let's say, methods of rejuvenating our thinking about Africa, since this is the core call of this seminar series. And one last pointer, I'm still trying to give you some idea of what I mean by general ecology, using, in this case, Tutuola, but I could have convoked many other sources. Finally, in this general ecology, the earth is a sort of binder. It's a sort of binder which makes possible the passage from one form to another, metamorphosis. And because it is the receptacle of every single form of life, it also assumes the properties of a vibratorium. It has vibratory, sensory properties which pre-exist those of human beings. But as I have just said, the earth's body and flesh, like all bodies and flesh, is fungible, it is perishable, and it is in permanent contact with matters of death. And because of that, it constantly runs the risk of decomposition. That is why it requires to be constantly repaired and constantly shared. Reparation and sharing becoming, in this instance, the preconditions for its durability. So the theory of general ecology is, in fact, a theory of durability. How is it that the human becomes actively part with the rest of the creation, part of the an ending process of sustaining life, and in sustaining life, let's say, opening up the door to durability. I wanted to give you all these elements in order to somewhat ground our discussion on some form or the other of close reading of African texts. Now, let me move to the next step in my presentation tonight. And now, share with you another set of remarks on, let's say, where are we now? We have listened to Tutuola. One might say, oh, very good, but this is about yesterday. Where are we today? It seems to me that we have entered an age of brutal changes. Those of you who read French know that the book before the one I'm talking about tonight was called Brutalism. It was published just before the COVID epidemic. It's not yet translated in English. They are working on it. It will be probably this year, by the end of the year, you'll be able to read it in English. But among the brutal changes that affect the living in this age of the earth, as I call it, the age of the earth, just as we had the age of iron and all that, seems to me now, this age is the age of the earth. So among the changes that affect the living in this age of the earth, there are three in particular, which I think deserve to be examined from the kind of general ecology perspective, which I have just briefly outlined. And that's what I want to do now. The first brutal change we are facing, of course, at different degrees, scales, but all of us. The first has to do with the world's ongoing combustion. And when I say the world's ongoing combustion, what I really have in mind is the key event of our times, which has to do with our, when I say our, humanity's possible exit from the climate niche in which humans and non-humans have thrived for the past 6,000 years. We are exiting from that niche. And of course, we have very many studies, scientific studies, that are showing precisely the modalities of this exit and looking into its potential consequences. So it seems to me that is the key event of our times. Because, of course, the planet's regions are not impacted equally or to the same extent. But in spite of that, overheating is real everywhere. Oxygen is now affected with scarcity. And the kind of radical vulnerability of bodies can no longer appear as accidental. And as the planet becomes ever smaller, the utopia of limitless growth has, of course, run its own course. If only because study after study shows that we will inevitably reach thresholds, lethal thresholds, if nothing is done, resulting in what, if not heat exchange blockages, protein deformation, the destruction of muscle cells, poor blood circulation, and so forth and so on, all these organic events which affect our body. Our first, I would say, property. Our body is, if you want to think in terms of property, is our first property, port of call. But this, of course, if it keeps going on, will jeopardize more than the human body's cooling mechanisms. The Earth's body itself and its vital organs will fail in a kind of interconnected chain. That is the first major brutal change affecting this age of the Earth, and which we have to reflect upon from the perspective of what are called general ecology. And this, I'm able to articulate it using our deep archives, Africa's deep archives. They allow us to, let's say, face that new task that is put to, let's say, the project of critique. The second major change has to do with, this time, another process, the process of planetarization. And a key driver of the process of planetarization is capitalism. In fact, we are currently ruled by the market. You know, those of you who are interested in, let's say, international relations theory, or the kind of the political philosophy of world government, which the likes of Kant did pay some attention to in a number of works, including, of course, his Perpetual Peace, in which he tries to imagine what would a government, a form of government for the entire world, what it might look like, or what would prevent it from happening. How is it that we could imagine such form of universal government in a context in which nation states would, in any case, keep key elements of their sovereignty. And the result of Kant's elaborations is, let's say, a name has been given to it, to them, cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism being not really a form of government, but I would say a kind of mental disposition, a certain disposition to relative openness, a relative openness to the other with O, capital O, which means that cosmopolitanism as a concept still relies somewhere on some double bind, the double bind between identity on the one hand and difference on the other, which allows, therefore, that dialectics of identity and difference, which allows to carve out a little space for the other. So cosmopolitanism, in that sense, is not really the in common I'm talking about. But what I'm saying is that, in fact, today we do have a universal form of government, or of rule, or governmentality, if you want, which is the market. We are currently ruled by the market. And the market's deep aspiration has always been, in any case under capitalism, to become a totality. To become a totality, meaning to become our core moral experience. But so has technology. Left to itself and its own devices, technology has also developed such aspirations to become a totality and to become our core moral experience. So the point I'm making is that as I speak, both the market and technology now set the rules, the procedures, according to which, for instance, we are obliged to live together as a collective body within new planetary limits. And this we see with the multiplication of digital ecosystems. And put together, these digital ecosystems now form what is known as platform capitalism, one, if not the key driver of planetarization. But planetarization as not something smooth, but as something that indeed re-engineer frictions and collisions and forms of violence, each ever abstract than the one that preceded it. So that's the second major change we have to interrogate from the perspective of general ecology, drawing on our deep archives, which so far have not really been harnessed to the extent which they actually offer. So the point I'm making is that, in fact, Africa still has so much to contribute to the key debates of our time, provided we, as I have kept marshalling, we take seriously these archives. The third change concerns, I would argue, the world into which we have already entered. And this world will be mostly dominated by computational reason. And in fact, as we speak, gigantic computing devices are in the making, and there will be, to the 21st century, what the alliance of steel and concrete was to the 19th and 20th centuries. In other words, technology is going, more than ever before, to be one of the fundamental forces of our world, in the sense that it will provide this world with a semblance of unity, but will also drag it into a process of splintering, endless fragmentation. And in this respect, technology will leave a profound mark on the world's future. And more than this, it will become our environment. It will become the territory in which we move, or to use a specialized term, it will become our biotop. And the term biotop, you have bios, life, and topos, the location, if you want. It will become our biotop. It is thanks to and through it that new imaginary territories, new languages will appear, that the living will have its coexistence organized, that other ways of making or breaking the world will emerge. So I could go on and on this. I'm sure that you understand what I'm talking about. Now, of course, these three key changes, transformations, are already paving the way for new forms of power. And a number of us have been working on this question of kind of power that is let's say, the double, if you want, of these times of ours. But it seems to me that for the most part, these new forms of power that computing devices, which now feature in the daily experience of millions of human beings, highlighting, they in fact foreshadow the advent of a new form of power. I want to call it mutant power. M-U-T-A-N-T, mutant power. By which I mean a kind of power whose properties are invisibility and often undetectability. By which I mean a form of power that is fundamentally predicated on the predation of the living, not just natural resources, extraction of natural resources, not just the pillaging of bodies, of which we know something about through the historical event of the slave trade, the plantation system, but a form of power which lives on the predation of the living, le vivant. Mutant power, the kind of power I'm talking about, which is emerging, has two other dimensions I want to signal telegraphically. The first one is radioactive, and the second one is viral. Radioactive meaning irradiative, and viral means parasitic, because that's what viruses are for. I mean, that's how they are made. So parasitic and radioactive. Radioactive in the sense that it moves by irradiation. And here I rely fundamentally on the work of a Japanese critic called Sabu Koso. Koso, K-O-H-S-O. Sabu Koso is the author of a book. I recommend it to you. It is called Radiation and Revolution. It was published exactly the same year as my work, Brutalism, in 2020. Or for those of you who are in a hurry, I recommend an article he wrote still in 2020 in the New Inquiry. It is called Radiation, Pandemic, Insurrection. Sabu Koso has taken a key event that happened, I can't remember exactly when, but you remember Fukushima. Fukushima is the big event, the catastrophe, which happens when you have a combination of two major events. On the one hand, a tsunami, which causes a nuclear explosion. So you have that combination of really two cataclysmic events. Some of them we can say naturally induced, but as we know nowadays, I mean, very few things are naturally induced. And the other one is humanly induced. The coming together of the human and nature, both of them, as to, let's see, paraphrase Dipesh Chakrabarti, both of them now acting as geological forces. So I borrow these two properties from his work. Of course, mutant power, and that's the point I want to make before I now begin to try to wrap up this presentation. Mutant power spreads. The idea that power spreads. And by spreading in the course of its spread, it sometimes produces either non-organic or machinic effects, but effects that are dispersed both in space and in time. And even more importantly, organic effects that directly attack social relations. That what is under attack by mutant powers, it's what I told you was at the heart of general ecology, that is relationality, relation. That is what is under attack by mutant power. Mutant power, as it is premised on an infrastructure, in the sense that it is populated by processors, by cameras, by objects connected to all sorts of surfaces, including bodies. And mutant power not only does attack relations, it also acts through enclosure, including even where it claims to be ensuring the protection of lives. So we could go on and on this. I hope you have some sense of what I am trying to get at. So if you want, that's where we are. I told you what's the background. Where we are is precisely this. Now let me then try to wrap up all of this by coming back to where I started, the idea of the last utopia, or if you want, the idea of the earth as the last utopia. And I think that this is a proposition we can defend, especially if, as I have kept saying, we do this from the perspective of a general ecology. Because as a matter of fact, in African systems of thought, our relationship with the earth has never been merely economic. The relationship has always been a quasi-existential one of exchange, insofar as the material that is the earth is imprinted in us at the same time as it receives our imprints, at the same time as it receives our memory, our traces, the material remains of disappeared bodies, the bodies of all those who, born of the earth, have returned to it. This is what makes the earth flesh, the flesh of ancestors. It is also what makes death a libation, because in the earth, a symbol of permanence, being sheds its perishable envelope of a body and is stabilized. And if it is indeed true that to die means to go into the earth or to rise as aroma to the heavens, then death is ultimately a way of nourishing the earth, in the sense that its function is to reaffirm the principle of consubstantiality between the soil and the human person. This is what we learn, for instance, when we study Dogon myths, Bambara cosmologies, or the cosmologies of the ancient people of the Congo. So in its major sense, which I am employing here, the earth is precisely that which one can only move across. Only temporarily can we inhabit it or stay physically on it. After which, only the traces or marks of this passage speak for us in memory of who we will have been with others in their midst. Back to the question of the relation, Glissant's concept of relation. So our fundamental relationship to the earth is therefore that of the passerby, le passant. The earth receives us and shelters us as passers-by. It also maintains the traces of our passage as passers-by, and in the last resort, it is perhaps this tension between sojourn and temporality, passage and permanence, that gives the earth its character as indecipherable enigma, something that the ideology of property stubbornly refuses to accept. On the other hand, the earth does not exist as a naturally constituted political entity. There's no earth people, there's no earth nation. As I speak, there's no earth government, no earth parliament, no earth army, or no earth police force. So, the earth as a global political unit exists only as a utopia, perhaps the last of all. And that's what the book Sabelo spoke about. That's what it deals with. But from, once again, use of deep African archives. So let me end this by therefore arguing that as a political community, the earth must be imagined. It must be convened. It must be assembled, must be created. It is, in that sense, a name that will always refer to a reality, to a time ever ahead of us, to a space opposed in all points to that of nation states, a space irreducible to that of empires, with their countless walls, their borders, their enclosures, their passports, and their requirements for visas. So the name of earth is and will always, in that sense, refer to a subject that must be composed and consequently to an ever irresolvable dispute among its components, humans included. It is this idea, political idea, which of course refers us to the possibility of general reservoir of life, that I wanted to share with you tonight. Thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, thank you so much, Prof, for this generous offering and leading us really in understanding the time we're living in. whether we fear it or not, but we need to be courageous as you do to tell us exactly this is where we are. And I want to hand over to Bongani to moderate the next part of this session. We are really grateful for this offering.
Thank you, Sabelo. Thank you. You never disappoint. It's thought-provoking. Colleagues will invite, if we have comments, questions, you can write them on the chat and raise your hands. So the platform is available to engage with Professor Mbembe's lecture. So we can start. See, I'm trying to check in the chat. So some of the questions, one of which is from Francisco in the chat, who's asking, how could the media, so journalism, cinema, advertising, support the rebuilding of consciences and communities under Operation for Change? And maybe I should take you up here, then I'll go back to the questions on the chat. So please go ahead.
Okay.
So up here, if you can do that, if you can ask you have your hand up. And just unmute yourself, please. Maybe while we are waiting for him, Professor Mbembe, there is another question from Matthew, who asked whether you could please elaborate on the connection between Krizan's concept of relation and your idea of general ecology. So there is a question there. Perhaps if I could allow you to address those questions, then
okay,
we'll take
I will try. Let me begin with the Matthew's question, and then I will move to Francisco's. There is indeed a difference between Glissant's concept of relation and what, for the time being, I prefer to call the paradigm of general ecology, as I try to tease it out using, in particular, let's say, African pre-colonial systems of thought. Let's just call them that way. In this case, in the case of what I have shared tonight, and in the case of the expanded developments I make in the book itself, I have mostly relied on Dogon and Bambara cosmologies. The Dogon are a very important community that has always lived in Mali. The Bambara too, they live in Mali, but you also find them in neighboring countries. It happens that some of their most important myths have been recorded in the early years of colonialism by historians and anthropologists. They have been recorded and retranscribed, and one such key text was published in the 50s by a French anthropologist called Marcel Griol, who spent years interviewing a very old Malian thinker called Ogotemeli. And the book is called Dieu d'eau. But there are many other myths, beginning with myths of creation, which have also been the object of conservation. So the concept of general ecology, I draw it from that source, that archive. It is pretty evident that what these systems of thought say about the human, what they say about the universe, or for that matter, the cosmos, what they say about the very process of creation. How is it that all these inhabitants of the earth happen to exist? All that material is really a discourse on relation. And it is a discourse that is grounded on the very materiality of life, beginning with the body, the human body, as it emerges, as it grows, as it turns into a force, a vital force, and as it is exposed throughout its life cycle to processes of perishing. The difference with Glissant is that Glissant is speaking from an archipelago, speaking from his experience in the Caribbean. He has in mind very firmly a different kind of experience which has to do with the Middle Passage, the huge tragedy of the Middle Passage. But he goes beyond that death event, mass death event, mass killing event. He goes beyond that to then look into ways in which, in the aftermath of such a catastrophe, such a deep engagement with the abyss and the forces of darkness, forces of the night, how is it that life can be recomposed? Beginning with language, pays a huge attention on question of language. And therefore, his thinking is not grounded as the one from the Dogon on a deep, that kind of deep archive. Is grounded on, as I put it, a catastrophe. But Glissant is extremely sensitive to the ecological nature of what we could call the life event, which he reads poetically, which in the book I try to read geologically and in terms of its exact material. That's what I would say, that there are two different approaches with the same insistence on the precedence that relation takes over ontology, over, let's say, identity. And both approaches, let's say, share another aspect which has to do with the open-endedness of historical time and possibilities. Now, Fernando wanted me to speak more concretely on the extent to which if I understand well, media, let's see, media forms may indeed contribute to the raising of consciousness in context of oppression. What strikes me is the fact that, you see, we now have at our disposal countless technological devices of the type we have never had in the entire history of humanity. And we keep having more and more of such devices. These devices keep becoming smaller and smaller, and nanotechnologies. And most of them are not only becoming smaller and smaller, they are also becoming wearable, portable. They are also becoming, in fact, not a supplement at all, but a key element of our own corporality. That it's impossible nowadays to imagine the human body without its supplement, without its artifacts. And therefore, human bodies and also minds are becoming more and more androgenic, if you want. To the extent that the old separations we used to entertain between the mind and the body, between nature and culture, between the artifact, that means something that is created by us, and who we are, all these distinctions are gradually morphing into something much more symbiotic, to the point where it's the very concept of life that is being interrogated. So I have the feeling that that is the general context, and that to a large extent, the big risk we are running, the mother of oppressions, if you want, the big risk we are running is for technological devices to achieve a status of freedom unseen before, to no longer be utensils of life, which is, in fact, their function, raison d'être, but to become so autonomous as to operate in and for themselves. And therefore, for humanity to reach that level, André Leroi-Gourhan foresaw the moment when speech, meaning the realm of meaning, is entirely divorced from the realm of means. That we begin to confuse tools with ends, with finality. It seems to me that's the kind of discussion the likes of Heidegger and many others conducted not so long ago, Heidegger in his questions concerning technology. But Heidegger was reflecting in the age of machines. We are now far beyond the age of the machines. And therefore, it seems to me, Francisco, that we have to reframe the question somewhat and take into account the kind of complexity our world is experiencing, and from within it begin to ask ourselves, what would it mean? You know, what would emancipation mean if we are unable to give sense to the creations, artificial creations we make? It's a long response to a rather complex issue, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you, thank you. We have quite a number of raised hands. I don't know whether Opie is still around to ask the questions. Then we have the team is online. If we can recognize you, then I'll come to you also.
All right. Thank you so much for giving me the floor. I'm Dr. Omaru from Bamenda, Cameroon. I want to greet Professor maybe I just heard today. I saw the publicity of this meeting on WhatsApp chat, and I decided to follow. I also want to greet Professor Sabelo. I've read him quite much and cited him in some of my works. I'm so glad to see you online. Prof, you talk about reality is redistributed. If I heard you well, reality is redistributed. But I had a problem with my network, so I didn't get the exposition that you did about what that concept is all about. Would you, for my sake, please explain what that means? You also talk about three fundamental changes that we are observing today. One is the world ongoing combustion. The second one is planetarization. And then the third is computational reason. I don't know what you mean by computational reason. Are you equating it to artificial intelligence? Those were my questions. Thank you very much, Professor. I did enjoy your exposition.
Thank you. Can we take just a few more hands? Asaf?
Okay. Thank you, Professor Bembe. Thank you. It's always good to listen to your thought-provoking lectures. My question is concerning the definition of animism, the way you define it as modes of thinking. Don't you think animism has to do more with theological terminology rather than ways of thinking? Because if animism becomes a way of thinking, then we might fall into the trap of spiritualize everything, so to say. So that would be my question. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Amane, if we can just take you, if Prof. Bembe, I can just take two more questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you so much, Prof. Bembe. I'm so happy to attend this seminar, but allow me to introduce my question in French. I want to be confident in what d'autre part, je préfère être à l'aise en français pour poser ma question. Donc, voilà, j'ai aimé vraiment votre cheminement, bien que je n'ai pas encore lu votre livre, mais je suis intéressée par les notions que vous avez développées ici, et particulièrement, vous avez dit que notre relation, sous-entendu la relation de l'être humain ou tout être vivant avec la Terre, et surtout la relation entre l'homme et la Terre ne doit pas être seulement économique. Malheureusement, ce que nous constatons aujourd'hui, si on parle aujourd'hui de changement climatique et tout ce qui en suit, cela est dû à l'action de l'homme sur l'environnement et principalement pour des raisons économiques. Alors, compte tenu du fait que nous sommes en train d'aller vers la digitalisation du monde avec l'intelligence artificielle, etc., quel est le sort, ou bien quel sera le sort des populations africaines qui n'ont pas encore accès aux nouvelles technologies? Avec le temps, est-ce que cette population moins avancée est appelée à disparaître? Ou bien quel est le sort qui lui est réservé? Est-ce que vous avez orienté aussi la réflexion dans ce sens-là? Ça me laisse un peu sur ma soif. Voilà, je suis Madame Bayong Djibergiaman du Tchad. Je suis une ancienne ministre de l'Agriculture et de l'Environnement. Je vois un peu à la manière dont on exploite la terre, mais c'est principalement pour des raisons économiques. Et là, ça m'a un peu interpellé. Merci.
Thank you. Prof, just one last question, then we'll deal with other many questions which are on the chat. Philip, if you can ask your question, then we'll allow Prof maybe to answer.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, Achille, good to see you again. My question concerns the term capitalism. Given the classical definitions of capitalism, which, to put simply, relies on tangible objects or material objects such as land, labor, money, machinery, in order to create profits, right? Can we still call the regime of market forces at play with respect to the planetization, the abstractions of data capture through all forms of algorithmic manipulations? Can we still call that these market forces at play capitalism against the backdrop of classical definitions of capitalism, or is it not important now to give it a new name? And if so, what name might that be beyond that term capitalism? Thank you.
Thank you. Prof, allow you to answer those 4 questions, then we'll deal with the questions on the chat.
Okay, thanks, Bongani. First of all, thank you, my compatriot in Bamenda. It was very nice to hear you. I was talking about something I called redistributive agency. What I was trying to say was that when we pay attention to ways of thinking and ways of acting as recorded in our part of the world by historians, anthropologists, and other researchers, it is easy to see how in ancient Africa, but also, I mean, in a number of cases nowadays, we did develop, let's just put it like this, a holistic view of life and existence, life and existence on Earth. Holistic perspective on life in the sense that life itself was a force, and it was a force humans did not monopolize. They didn't have a monopoly over that force. That force was not equally, but differentially redistributed among almost anything that inhabited the earth. So, for instance, a mountain could be endowed with a certain form of force, vital force. Specific forms of birds connected to specific family traditions of origins like that were given a specific position within the community. A community in itself was always somewhat made up of many different members. And when I say many different members, I really have in mind many different species. So there was no attempt at all at giving to the human the kind of position the human has been given in other traditions. For instance, in some dominant Western traditions. So people were considered to be powerful when they were able to add to their intrinsic powers myriad other forms of power they had either annexed from different species or borrowed from them in a process of endless accumulation. That's what I call redistributed agency, that in order to really be efficient, we had to compose, a human had to compose with the multiplicity of other inhabitants of his milieu or her milieu. And it seems to me that that was indeed a way of approaching what we call the environment or nature, which is less predatory, which is less extractive, which is more consonant with the necessity to attend to the different forms of life without which, let's say, there is no durability, neither to ourselves nor to our communities, or for that matter, to the earth itself. That's what I was trying to say. Then, Asaf, on animism. Look, I use animism here, not really, let's say, first of all, I took it in its original meaning in 19th century anthropology, where animism means the kinds of beliefs and ways of acting which is typical of children. That's originally that's the meaning of animism. These kinds of ways of thinking and acting, only children are capable of. And in that literature then, earlier anthropologists, what they want to show is that there used to be a time when we were all animists. When we say we, including them, including, of course, the West. And that the difference between the West and the rest, Africa in particular, is that the West managed at some point to transcend, to get out of that position where you think and act like a child. And primitive societies didn't. They remained children. That's the first definition of animism, if you want, the religion of children who never grew up, as opposed to us who at some point managed to exit that condition of infancy, mental and in relation to reason. Look, for instance, they believe that through divination, you can, let's say, achieve efficiency in terms of predicting an event or curing a disease, where in fact all that you need is proper scientific research into causality. So they don't know what are the causes of what, animists. So that's but I didn't really want to dwell that much on that. That's why I didn't call it animism, call it a general ecology. And it seems to me that the concept of general ecology is more likely to, first of all, read and interpret these modes of being in their own terms, not as derivatives of or things that are residuals of better or whatever. Put them in a hierarchical structure, which always ends up basically disqualifying us. So that's the move the conceptual move I was trying to make. Then Aman, your question is very complex, because on the one hand, you put your finger on a process that is ongoing and that is irreversible. We won't go back to the world we knew 40, 50 years ago, the world before digitalization. It won't happen. We are moving increasingly towards the world of artificial intelligence in all its consequences, most of which are unforeseen as we speak, and a process which itself is unregulated. I was reading a few days ago a rather troubling text by a scientist from Harvard, who shows the extent to which the key elements of the technological escalation our world is undergoing are completely unregulated. There's no government that has, let's say, control over any of that. So what it will open up to, only God knows. And to say that is not to be technophobe. To say that is to, as I tried to argue at the end of the presentation, is to try to point the finger on this widening gap, which is typical probably of our times, widening gap between symbols, the production of symbols and meaning on the one hand, and the hyper-reliance on instrumental reason, which means reason completely unfettered and reason impoverished, because to a large extent it is reduced to instrumentality, calculation, in a context in which, if I have to rely once again on the perspective of general ecology, in a context in which, as we know, we learn from the African archive, there are limits to calculation. And this takes me to Philip's comments, which I do share, in the sense that the essence of capitalism, of course, it's, Philip, all that you talked about, how to grab resources, how to, let's say, exploit and turn everything into profit. But behind that, there's an epistemology which relies fundamentally on calculation, on the idea that everything can be the object of calculation. And in fact, from the paradigm I was trying to push forward, the idea is the opposite, that we have to think anew the very idea of the incalculable, that certain things are incalculable. So this idea of incalculability is the opposite of capitalism. Let's call it the way we want. But of this kind of impulse that has led to the destruction of the earth. So what I'm saying is that if we take Africa seriously, our own archive seriously, it is possible to imagine different forms of power. Let's say situations where power is imagined, let's say it consists in making room for everyone, not only human beings, making room for. It's about weaving links, and the weaving of links, of all kinds of links, requires, for instance, that one renounce violence or that it be suspended, because violence is a form of inert production, as we have seen so many times. So if we look seriously into our archives, we can see the extent to which our conception of life has been based on the idea that life is constructed and reconstructed from the links that are constantly established between all the figures of being, without any discrimination or exception. And if there is a property of the earth with capital E, it's precisely this refusal to discriminate. The earth is the receptacle where everything, every entity, every force, every being is welcomed and has a space. So what counts is that a place is made for all, and that no one is excluded, not just humans. It is our common participation in energies, in forces with which alliances are forged, but which exceed each of us taken separately. That's the concept of general ecology. And therefore, the relationship between humans and the rest of the living world, is not based on a thirst for appropriation, for conquest, but on the contrary, on an ethic of disappropriation. I could go on and on and on. I mean, Sabelo and Bongani should organize for us a long seminar on this idea of general ecology, where we read our own texts, we revisit them, and we try to see to what extent, relying on the richness of these texts, we can say something fundamental on the course our world is taking today. So it seems to me that that's what the invitation has been. And if I can contribute to it a little bit, of course, I will do that.
Thank you very much. We'll take in probably the last round of questions, and we have got several questions on the chat. I don't know whether we can start with the question that is posed by Sam there on the chat, and he requests you to explain the shift from the planet to the earth as the utopian figure of community, and why we should now speak in terms of planetarization rather than globalization when we want to think about the spread of capitalism. So that is the question from Sam. Then there is Colin.
Sorry, can you repeat it briefly? I didn't get
yes.
it.
Okay. Let me just go back. Sam says, could you please explain why we should shift from the planet to the earth as the utopian figure of community, and why we should now speak in terms of planetarization rather than globalization as we understood capitalism? That is his question. And then The next question is by, let me see, by Bahet, who's asking, what is the future of human intellect in the age of algorithmic thinking and automated reasoning? I hope you got that, Professor. Then Colin is asking, he says, I noted that general ecology has influences from relational identity and animism, and he's asking, is there a place for Ubuntu in general ecology? I don't know whether you got that. And maybe we should take the question from Giuseppe, who's asking, will there be any good or bad in this community of Earth? And as a condition to the unfolding of this community, all conflicts will be resolved, as I understand it. And will the community move toward a common existence? And let's see, and theology, a moral or finally a natural one. So that is Giuseppe. And then let's go Muranyazi, who's asking whether is there life beyond Earth as you described it? And will there be another planet that supports life the way the Earth does? And then Catherine is asking, could you discuss the shift in your thinking from the post-colonial criticism to the environmental one? That is the main question. What ways and degrees have the three main monotheistic religions distorted or damaged the relationship between humans and the rest? If you could just maybe address those questions, Prof, and give your concluding remarks.
Oh, okay. Okay, these are very important questions, and as you understand, I won't be able to do justice to each of them. So look, as we are moving towards the end, let's see, I will try to put them all together and look, maybe just explain why it is that my own thinking has been moving in this direction. It seems to me that in the history of life, which is back, the history of life, except that there's a little change here, not a little, a serious one. You see, the question of life has occupied us for a very, very long time. And for a long time, we were interested in finding out where does it originate from? How does it evolve, its evolution? And how is it that at the end, the Earth seems to be one of the very few planets where it did develop to the extent we know nowadays. So that was the big series of questions concerning life and life forms. What we have witnessed by, I would say, the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st is a shift from those questions of how does life begin, how does it evolve, to how does it end. So now, if you look, for those of you who follow those discussions, the big question is, how does life end? And it seems to me that the shift has occurred because in the history of life, humanity has been a constant and sometimes a blind force. It thought, humanity, that, for instance, it had only to conquer the power of water, the power of wind, of metals, fuels, or radioactive materials, to realize once and for all its project of universal domination. The belief being that salvation, to use this theological concept, salvation on earth would come through the machine. And Marx has written extraordinary pages on men and machines, which we should keep reading. Except that today we are no longer in the age of just machines. We have entered an age of further abstraction, which I have called the age of computational reason, which has an effect on everything else. And under the leadership of the West, we have tirelessly sought to free ourselves from natural organic environments instead of consciously making room for them, which is the basic principle of general ecology, making room for every single being and form. Now, of course, the West, and I use the term West here in really a generic sense. I have nothing against the West, but the West, having long ago decided to stamp a Dionysian course on its own history and to drag the rest of the world along with it, is now struggling to understand the difference between the beginning and the end. The difference, if any at all, between the artificial, the synthetic, and the living. And as a result, the world is being dragged into a vast process of cleaving whose consequences no one can predict. So it seems to me that is what the project of critique has to deal with now. Or in any case, part of the project of critique for this century has to, let's say, tease out the consequences of the fact that this is where we are, and help to respond to today's big question, which is, how are we to imagine other ways of inhabiting the earth, other ways of sharing it, other ways of repairing it, and taking care of it as a precondition for its durability and our own durability. And it is here that it seems to me African metaphysics are particularly useful. Their time is now, because they teach us so much. They teach us about how, for instance, the quality of exchanges with the environment is one of the conditions for growth, for reproduction, fertility. The later being not only a question of birth, but of metabolism in the most general sense of the term. That is, a thwarting of the forces of entropy and degeneration. So I want to end with this idea of the debt of life, because that's precisely what ensues from what I have been trying to argue tonight. And when you look at our myths, our cosmogonies, our systems of thought, the idea of the debt of life is absolutely central to whatever we have been able to create historically. And the debt of life, in the sense that it demanded an extended participation of living beings, of artifacts, in action on matters, on bodies, and so forth and so on. And when I say that the last utopia today consists in coming back to the earth, it means coming back to Africa and coming back to our archives, because the earth is the last name of a we that would include human beings as well as objects, viruses, plants, animals, oceans, machines, all the forces and energies with which we must now learn to live in biosymbiosis. And let me end here, Sabelo and Bongani, because I know these are issues that are absolutely crucial to all of us. The greatest obstacle to the idea of a we is, however, racism. Because racism is the ultimate neurosis of separation. It is the exact opposite of any consciousness of the in common. So, in order to truly, let's say, imagine the new we, or what I call in the book, the in common, we will have to keep fighting against racism and its avatars, colonialism, imperialism, and so forth and so on. So let me end it there and really thank all of you for a fantastic evening and wish good luck to our next speakers in this marvelous series. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof, and thank you really for taking your time from one meeting to this one. We can't even thank you in a better way, because this actually challenges us to think more deeply, not about disciplinary debates, but about something which actually affects all of us. And the questions, I think, which emanated from your presentation actually indicates that we are really talking about something which touches almost everyone. Thank you so much, Prof, and we will allow you to rest, and we really appreciate your commitment to our series.
Yeah,
and thank you to the colleagues who came online, and thank you for those who posed the questions. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Bongani, for the moderation. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. We'll communicate the next one.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you for an amazing.
Thank you. It was so amazing.
Yeah. It's good.